Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming out to the Center for International Development. This event today is part of our brand new Spring 2023 Spotlight Series on Afghanistan. And so thank you for being part of this inaugural Spotlight Series that we're hosting. CID is hosting this in partnership with other centers across Harvard University, with the Carr Center for Human Rights, the Center for Public Leadership, the Women in Public Policy Program, and the Mitchell Institute for South Asia. And the reason we all came together this spring to think about not just a one-off event, a panel, workshop, is really, if for those of you following the situation in Afghanistan, it's incredibly heartbreaking what has been happening since the US withdrawal back in 2021. There's been a series of steps, rules, policy, doctrines that have taken place that have made life incredibly more and more difficult for ordinary Afghans, including and especially women and girls, to be able to live the full potential of their lives. So whether you're talking about the humanitarian perspective, political, cultural, economic, social, and onward, there's a series of policy decisions, and especially here for those of you that are at the Kennedy School as public policy leaders, that really require further examination and thinking and our collective individual and global responsibilities to our partners, friends, and citizens of Afghanistan. So first, just to say thank you for being part of our Spotlight series on Afghanistan. If you go to our webpage at CID, you can see the entire series of events. There's multiple events, panels. There's a workshop coming up on reproductive rights that Seema Samar is hosting. There's study groups and the like. So there's a lot of really exciting programming happening. And for those of you that like to help us launch even more programming on this space, please do let us know. So today's event is really exciting for us in particular. And let me just introduce myself. I'm Fatima Sumar, the Executive Director here at the Center for International Development. I'm particularly really honored to be here today for this panel because we're going to talk and really dive in to really better understanding the humanitarian and political implications for what is happening in Afghanistan, particularly for women and girls. And we really have an incredibly stellar lineup here today for the next hour to dive in. So for those of you, how many of you are familiar right now, just so we can scene set, how many of you are familiar with the latest of what's happening in Afghanistan? And don't worry if you're not, but just raise them high so we can just get a sense of scene setting here. Okay, so about maybe 2/3 of the room. So for first, we want to make sure that we can all walk away with the same shared understanding of what's actually happening and taking place, to hear perspectives and local perspective of what's happening on the ground, and then to really ask ourselves here at Harvard, what's our own responsibility of what can we do about the situation? What can we do in this moment to avoid generational catastrophe, really, for 40 million Afghans who are currently living under some of the harshest conditions in the world. So without further ado, let me tell you a little bit about who we've had the run of show and opportunities for this afternoon. So first, I'm just so incredibly delighted that we have Janti Soeripto with us. Janti is the president and chief executive officer of Save the Children USA. She assumed the role in January 2020 after serving as president and chief operating officer since May 2019. Yanti's responsible for so many things in the SAVE ecosystem in the world. I won't read her entire formal bio, but she's also one of those very rare and few NGO leaders that doesn't just kind of stay in global headquarters. She goes all around the world. She's on the ground, both publicly and privately, trying to really move the needle for the constituencies that SAVE cares the most about. And just as one example of that, Yanti was in Kabul in Afghanistan back in January after the decree came out, really making it very difficult for the INGO and NGO community to work in the humanitarian spaces with local Afghan women and girls. And so Yanti is really a tremendous leader who has frontline experience in so many countries around the world. So Yanti, thank you for coming up to Cambridge to be with us today. I'm also incredibly honored to have with us Naheed Esar here, who's with us as well. For those of you that don't know Naheed, she's an incredible leader, not just in Afghanistan, but globally. She is the former Deputy Foreign Minister of Afghanistan, and she's worked for over 14 years with different international and national agencies in senior management capacities. It's rare sometimes for those of you that have served in government roles in any country, not just Afghanistan, in any country around the world. It can be very hard for women to climb up the ladder and to assume positions of leadership where you're having such national impact. So Nahi, thank you for the tremendous leadership you've shown, both in Afghanistan, but also helping us think globally around the world. And I'm really delighted to moderate this stellar panel that we have Mohammed Alambegi with us. Mohammed is a graduate student here at Harvard, and he spent most of his life in rural Afghanistan. He earned his undergraduate degree from the University of Oxford, where he researched local agency and women's participation during the Soviet-Afghan War. He's worked with the City of London on the London Corporation on their refugee resettlement program. And as part of his classes, he's using inferential statistics here at Harvard to analyze the disproportionate violence against Hazaras in Afghanistan since 2021. So Mohammed, thank you so much for your leadership and what you're doing for your fellow countrymen and women in Afghanistan. So what we'd love to do for Run of Show today is Janti will kick us off with some opening remarks, scene setting for you, the work that she's been doing at SAVE on Afghanistan and how she sees the situation on the ground. Naheed will then follow with her views on the political situation so you can hear from Naheed's perspective. Mohammed will then engage in a series of questions with both Janti and Naheed before opening it up to all of you for your questions, and we'll pass around mics when we get to that. Just a couple of housekeeping rules for today. First, if you haven't already signed up with the QR code, please help us do that. It helps us keep track of demand, student interest, and engagement. So 10 seconds of your time is worth gold on our data side, on our side. So thank you for helping us with that. And then the second piece is right after at 1 o'clock, Naheed and Janti have incredibly graciously offered to help all of you think through your own careers. It's very rare sometimes to get that kind of one-on-one and group career mentorship opportunity. Janti will be holding a career chat roundtable if you're interested in careers that Save the Children. For those of you looking for internships, jobs, it's a rare opportunity to get time with the CEO of one of the top INGOs in the world. Please take advantage of this. And she can impart tremendous wisdom and hear from you of what your interests and passions are as you think about potential career opportunities. Just to emphasize, SAVE is not just here in the United States, they're all around the world. So don't feel constrained by geography. And then Naheed has also graciously offered as part of our CID career chats to do one-on-one career mentorship opportunities with students. We still have a few slots available. So please be in touch. Claire's here in the front and can help direct traffic afterwards as well. It's very rare sometimes to understand if you're interested in government careers, how to really work through government political ladders. Oftentimes we bring speakers here from the United States. I'm really excited. We're doing a non-American here to talk about non-American careers and talking about it from the perspective of other countries. So please do take advantage. It doesn't, Nahi's experience, of course, in Afghanistan, but I think she has a lot to offer those of you from many other countries as well. So please take advantage of their generosity if it can help your own career planning as well. So with that, I'm incredibly honored, delighted, and can't wait for this conversation. Janti, I'm going to pass the mic to you. You can do it from there or here, whatever you're most comfortable with. And thank you all again.
Well, thank you, Fatima, for having me. I feel slightly humbled by this panel because I'm on this panel. I'm probably the person who knows the least about Afghanistan. So let me put that out there straight away, to manage your expectations. I've been to the country 3 times now, in January most recently, and then the year before, and then actually six or 7 years ago, which allowed me to see at least some of the differences since August of 2021. But maybe first a step back. Save the Children has been in Afghanistan since 1976. So a long, long time, under a variety of regimes, also for a long, long time. And even in the run-up to August of 2021, I would say, a lot of the country was already a patchwork of different regimes that we had to navigate. So it was already one of the more difficult operational contexts that Save the Children is working in. Having said that, we work in other difficult contexts too. We do work indeed in 116 countries. So we've seen our fair share of difficult governments, authorities, local, national level, etc., and how to make choices to continue to do our work in a principled manner versus being allowed access in a safe and secure way is always part of our daily reality. Now, in Afghanistan, maybe also a step back, and I realize there's lots of people in the room that are aware of the situation in country, but sometimes I have to tell people who go like, oh my God, it's a disaster. And we're like, yes, but for the last 20 years, we actually did make progress in Afghanistan. Under 5 mortality halved over the last 20 years. Maternal mortality massively decreased from being the highest in the world to being, not perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but certainly no longer in the bottom 10. We've seen millions of girls finish high school, go to university. I was always telling people there's 27% of the Afghan parliament were filled by women. Now that's not 50%, as you know, but there are many countries, including my own home country, that are nowhere near the 27%. And I think the US today barely scratches 28%. So sort of at the same level. So there was representation of senior women everywhere in government, in private business, in the NGO sector, as well as in their education system, universities, all the way down to primary and early education. So yes, there were problems. Yes, there were lots of people in poverty. Yes, there was food insecurity. Yes, there was still violence and insecurity in a lot of places. But the human capital development and the progress that was made in the last 20 years, we should never forget that was actually, a lot of that was working in the way that it is working in other countries around the world. So that's first and foremost. Now, Save the Children is still there. We did not leave the country, also not during the upheaval of August of 2021. Our country director there huddled for a few weeks in the UN compound, but as soon as it was possible again, went back to our office, reopened our office in Kabul and across the country. We work in 17 of the 34 provinces in Afghanistan. And in most of those provinces, we've been also for many, many years. And important to say, with mostly local Afghan colleagues from the region, which in the end is, and it's, I would say that for every country where we work, that is what gives us legitimacy, agency, but also the right level of knowledge of what is really needed and relevant in those communities. We reopened our offices as soon as we could, but even in August of 2021, it was very important for us to understand, can we do our work in a principled manner? Can we reach the people that we think are the most vulnerable? Can we do so safely, particularly with women in our workforce? And can we make sure that our normal rules of compliance, etc., can be upheld? Once we got that assurance, and again, you don't do that in Kabul, you do that region by region, province by province. It is a super local operational context in that sense. And once we got those assurances, and it sequentially it went across the country, we essentially restarted our activities in probably October time, and actually massively also scaled up because we saw humanitarian needs actually spike up almost immediately. And it was actually quite extraordinary to see when I was there last year, 6 months after the takeover, how fast food insecurity, poverty, unemployment rates had risen across the country. So we were really concerned, and we felt we really had to step in and step up to meet that moment, which means it is one of our largest operational responses in the world. It is still classified as the world's largest humanitarian crisis, also by the United Nations. The humanitarian response plan that's been put out under the United Nations is the biggest one. It is trying to reach 29 million Afghans in need, 6 million of whom are on the brink of famine. Many of those are children. Clearly, girls are not back in secondary school. We have 4 million girls out of school as we speak. So on that front, we've seen a lot of slide back over the past 18 months, and that clearly is deeply, deeply concerning. Let me just stop it right there in terms of context and then go to questions later. Are we to you?
It's working now. Hi, everyone. So my short existence as an Afghan will give you a brief history of Afghanistan's political, economic, and social instability over the past 5 decades. I was born in a Soviet-backed government raised in the midst of civil wars, followed by a fundamentalist regime, and then 20 years of the imported democratic governance structure. Today, unfortunately, we are back to the authoritarian fundamentalist regime. I was lucky to be born in a family of an educated mother and quite a progressive grandmother. My mother sacrificed her night's sleep, but made sure all her 5 children are well educated, all her 5 daughters, to be more precise. Because just like today, back then, Afghan women were banned from public sphere and were not allowed to go to schools and universities. And my grandmother took all the society's blame, but made sure her children, her grandchildren, and her loved ones' children, and her neighbors' children were educated. She lost 6 sons. Her 6 sons were martyred over the course of 40 years. But instead of giving up, she actually stood firm and strong. She built schools, she built hospitals and clinics, and she built homes for the widows and for women who had suffered over the course of 5 decades. When she passed away, national TVs in Afghanistan had a moment of basically remembering her. BBC and various national and international outlets wrote about her. My role model in my life is my mother and my grandmother. And Afghanistan is so full of such role models. But perhaps for that reason, today women are not allowed to go to school, because my example is a testimony to the saying, if you educate a man, you educate a man. But if you educate a woman, you educate a society. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for those powerful opening remarks. And before I get into the Q&A section in our discussion, I want to take us back to 2002. And I'm going to read a quick executive summary from a Save the Children report when they were resuming their operation with, once again, another government. So the report is called The Children of Kabul. From 2002, with support from UNICEF, they conducted a major consultation with children and their families living in Kabul. The aim of the research was to listen to children's views and to hear their experiences of daily life. They intended to gather information from children in order to guide the development of support programs for war-affected children in Afghanistan. And in the second, so this is the finding, and I want you guys to pay attention to the stark similarities between what you read and hear in the news now and the experiences of children who were children when the Taliban had just fallen in 2001, 2002. First, I'll start with a quote by a 16-year-old girl who said that one day I went to my lesson and the Taliban's car stopped near us, but we escaped before they beat us up. And when we got home, we were really afraid. Now, when I go to the course and see a car, I still think it might be a Taliban's car. So imagine a world where like a car can be a trigger for your PTSD and so on, and how devastating that could be for children. And then the report goes on to say how difficult it is for children during war. And one of the exercises that they had was the sad days exercise, where they would write about the terrible things and then the happy days. One of the happiest days was for most children the fall of the Taliban, and in 2001. And then one of the sad days was actually the coalition bombardment. So when the Americans went in, that was like a sad day for them. And so it talks about really normal things, like, you know, cutting boys' hair if it's too long, or banning girls from school, and girls waking up and feeling left behind as their brothers go to school. Like this is 2002 and 2023 at the same time. And it kind of goes to show how we have actually slid back a lot despite the achievements. So that was just some context that I found only a couple of hours ago to place this conversation. And my first question to both of you is about the achievements of the last 20 years. And you mentioned some of the stats, and I want to hear a little bit about some of the gaps and whether, and how is that going for Save the Children and also for Afghanistan generally. So 17 out of the 34 provinces, for example, who is working in other provinces, and I'd love to hear.
Um, sure. Look, there were gaps. There was still absolute gender inequality in Afghanistan, even before the latest takeover, predicated also by many years of varying regimes. Girls in school, girls out of school, girls back in school. Um, there were areas of the country that were unsafe to work. We actually didn't have access to some really rural, remote areas where there was literally active fighting going on. So one of the things that struck me when I was there last year, that we actually had access now to areas where we previously didn't have access, partly because the current de facto authorities were, you know, bombing or fighting in those areas. So physical access to some remote areas was really hard. Infrastructure was still lacking. I never forget, I was there 6 years ago. I went up to Mazar. There's a phenomenal school run by another one of these phenomenal Afghan women, female principal, 4,000 girls in high school. It was, on the one hand, fantastic to see. On the other hand, she said, look, half of the school building actually doesn't have a roof. So that means we sometimes have to have classrooms in the open air. That doesn't always work with the weather. It impacts learning. The number of female teachers that were available for girls made sometimes, or the gap in that sometimes made the classrooms too big, etc. So yes, of course, it wasn't perfect. Some of the education wasn't perfect. Lack of female teachers, lack of female doctors, um, lack of infrastructure. Some of the development funding wasn't necessarily always spent on time, in full, in a transparent way. So there were gaps, but there was absolutely a palpable sense of progress and development and impact, I would say, of the work that was done there, not just by SAFE, by many actors, many local partners, many phenomenal Afghan female leaders, like the principal that I was talking about, like your grandmother.
Well, I'll go to achievements first and then to gaps. We had democratic institutions. The Constitution of Afghanistan, I believe Article 23, emphasized on equal rights of all citizens, male and female. The Constitution emphasized on freedom of expression, on inclusive governance structures, on modern and structures based on human rights and women's rights. Parallel to that, we had democratic institutions. Officials were either elected or selected, so we had elections. Democratic institutions were newborn, but quite firm. Had they stayed longer, you would have had a strong democratic Afghanistan. Another achievement is economic / infrastructure development, from roads to schools to bridges. I mean, no wonder Kabul, the capital, was one of the fastest growing cities in the world for years. And then education, improvement in education, from 0% women and girls in schools in 2001 to 30% women and girls in schools in 2021. That number itself speaks about the education improvement. From numbers to improvement in curriculum in general. But gaps too stayed within those achievements. Yes, we had democratic institutions, but they were unfortunately imported democratic institutions. The concept democracy was imported, and likewise, many modern concepts were imported. So democratic institutions did not have, in a society as complex and as conservative as Afghanistan, democratic institutions did not have a bottom-up approach. They rather had top-down approach. Basically, policies, legal framework in general, were written, drafted, implemented, and overseen by international community with the Kabul bubble / the Kabul elites. So quite far from ground realities, and quite far from the context of Afghanistan. Economic development, likewise, was based on, vast majority was based on foreign aid. The minute foreign aid was cut from Afghanistan, economic collapse came. And then education, I mean, we did have quite improvements in education. Oh, yes, there were corruption. There's some level of corruption. For instance, MEC Monitoring and Evaluation Committee had one of their findings was that there's about 8,000 ghost teachers. Sorry. So yes, there were ghost teachers, ghost schools. Corruption was there, but we had hope, and we had streets for the realm of Afghan girls going to schools with their white scarves and black uniform.
Thank you so much. Yeah, so for the rest of I have two more questions before we go to the Q&A. Now I want to kind of, so now that we have a bit of a context of what happened in the last 20 years and the backsliding and so on, it's just about navigating the current world since August of 2021. Like what was it like to resume the operations and work in Afghanistan, and having that dilemma of like not legitimizing the de facto authorities, but also serving the children? I'd like to hear a little bit from Janti on that. And for Naheed, I want to ask you about the responsibility that people should share. Like, who do you think should be held accountable and responsible for the calamity of 2021? Is it the international community? Is it the Afghan political elite? Is it the people? Like Biden suggested that the people didn't have the will to fight or something. So I just want to kind of get your thoughts on how should this this crisis be seen in that context.
So just to give you a bit more context, and I cannot speak enough about how amazing our Afghan colleagues are on the front line working for Save the Children and many other NGOs, local and international ones. We have over 5,500 staff currently in Afghanistan. Almost half of those are women, by the way. We have internationals there, as we have in every country, but the percentage is actually relatively small. I think it's about 25 to 30 or so. So large contingent of fantastic, well-educated, very committed, passionate, professional Afghan colleagues there. And important to remember, our senior management team there, we lost quite a few during the upheaval in August. A lot of them fled. We did support a few of them actually to get out, get refuge in other countries. And that was necessary, we felt, for their safety, particularly because of the work that they had done for us or on behalf, particularly of women and girls. But that also meant that we had to rebuild. So it was great to help some of them get out. But then, of course, we had to rebuild all of that capacity in country. And we did so, I think, in super quick time. So we managed to get back up and running. What struck me when I was there in March of 22 were, I think, a couple of things. One, how fast we managed to scale up and do almost double, almost triple the number of programmatic activities. And this means over 3,500 classrooms full of boys and girls, sometimes even co-ed in some provinces, which really struck me, actually. And yes, and some for boys and some for girls. We were training over 1,000 female teachers to make sure that we could continue to have education. We were running almost 100 mobile health clinics in particularly rural parts of the country where that is essentially the only healthcare, basic healthcare available to people. So we were doing a lot of that work. A quarter of our response there was cash transfer programming, essentially giving people dignity and choice by giving them cash in a context where a banking system was essentially completely non-functioning. So we were doing all of that. Now, of course, the context had changed massively. The one thing that struck me immediately when you go into the ministries and you have these conversations with, at the time, and by now, we're Taliban leaders in all those ministries, there was not a single woman inside. And that is really, and I was there 6 years ago when there were, senior women in all of my conversations, Ministry of Education, Health, Refugees, Disaster Management, etc. And we went back to all of these ministries, and you essentially see 0 women in the building, right? Which is a slightly, in 2022 and 2023, to have that is such a visceral reminder of that backward slide and how we should never take these things for granted. But we were back to work. We felt relatively good about our ability to deliver at scale and to do so with quality and with safety. And safety was actually better than it was before, as I said. But just to give you an example, in March of 22, I was there. We were talking about the importance of girls returning to secondary school. This was just before schools were reopening after the winter break. And even at the time, I was told in the ministry that we would get, yes, girls would go back to school, secondary school. And literally the 2 days before schools would reopen, there was a U-turn and girls were not allowed back in school. And this is, just to, we say these things, you hear them on the news, but to just imagine yourselves with you, if you are a woman, if you have sisters, if you have daughters, to go to school with their backpacks and their books and their pencils and everything else, and to be then turned away whilst the boys were allowed in is it's unimaginable for us here. And that is still the reality today, even though we were giving assurances that there would be a review of the guidelines, of the curricula for girls, etc. But as of today, 4 million girls are still out of school in Afghanistan. Then end of last year, we had another backslide. There was essentially a ban on women working for NGOs, local and international ones. As I said, Save the Children, half of our staff are women, but not just because of that. We felt we had to stop our work immediately. It's a principled issue for us, but it's also a hugely practical issue for us. You cannot deliver assistance to women and children if you rock up with men. And I keep saying this, explaining this to people also here. We're like, can you imagine if you were a woman, would you go into a food distribution line if you see only men? I don't think I would do that here, let alone in a country like Afghanistan. I don't think any woman in the world would do that anywhere. So to be able to give birth safely in a hospital, you need female doctors and nurses and midwives. So those were the conversations that we were having when we went there in January with the leadership, of course, with our own teams, with the UN partners, essentially trying to make sure that the humanitarian sector, which was vastly impacted by this, agreed and aligned behind that principle that we would not do our work with men only, essentially eradicating women from public life even more than was happening to date. And that's the line we've held. We've then been able to go back to work slowly, province by province, by getting assurances that women would not be harassed, and we would go back to office, go back to classrooms, go back to mobile health units. And that's sort of the situation that we have. So it is doable to do principled humanitarian work in Afghanistan at scale. Yes, it is super hard. It is much harder than we'd like it to be, but it is possible. And that's been the message we've also been giving to the international community, because in the end, it's very easy to say, oh, this is so hard. It's too hard to work. It's better to spend our scarce dollars somewhere else. But this is the place to spend our dollars, and accepting that it is messy, accepting that it is hard, accepting that it is sometimes more expensive than it ought to be because of all these operational barriers, but that we have to persevere, because it is not just about saving 6 million people from starvation, wholly unnecessarily so, but also because we have to continue to message that women's rights are human rights. We are also there to show why it is important to have women working. 30% of staff in NGOs in Afghanistan, across local and international organizations, are women. They are often the breadwinners of their family. It is also an economic imperative to show that women are as important as men for sustainable economic development of a country.
Just to add one more point to what Janti said, in less than 2 years, the current authoritarian regime has issued 42 edicts restricting women from public sphere. Women are not allowed to go to schools, to universities, to parks, to gyms, to you name it, anywhere in public sphere. Women are not allowed to travel nationally and internationally without a minder. The streets of Afghanistan have become the realm of Afghan men. Women are seen nowhere. But to come back to the question, who is responsible? Well, there are multiple parties that are responsible. Former warlords are responsible for the current situation. Corrupt politicians are responsible for the current situation. The current regime definitely is responsible for what's happening in Afghanistan. International community is responsible for abruptly deciding to leave, evacuate everything and leave Afghanistan. All in all led to a corrupt, insecure, deprived Afghanistan. I missed a few target killing attempts, and so, like myself, unfortunately, many, especially women who were in public sphere, were targeted. Some of them, some of my closest friends, were actually unfortunately killed, but I was one of the few who, I was once less than an inch away from a gunshot. So they're all equally responsible.
Thank you so much for that. And now I just want to sort of end with a question about moving forward. What I know it's very depressing, and I'm glad that you sort of like named it and said that it's like we have to do it. It's the biggest humanitarian crisis in the world, and we can't give up. So yeah, what are some of the things that you've learned in your experience with the Taliban in your 2 trips, and despite them giving the assurances and then going back against it, like, and yeah, like what do you predict will happen? I know it's very difficult, and yeah, what do you want this room and like policymakers and political leaders to know and do about Afghanistan? And this is for both of you.
So I'm definitely not in the prediction business. I'll say up front. I've learned that quickly in this sector that is a bad place to be. Look, when I was there in January, what always strikes me in Afghanistan is the enormous resilience and energy that is still there. I was talking to actually a lot of female leaders of local NGOs, our partners, my own female colleagues there, and of course they're outraged, and at times probably, you know, it's super depressing. But they were so energetic and so creative. They were also telling me, look, we've seen this rodeo before. We have always continued to work. Women make this country work. And we have found ways around it. And if you go to the local communities and you talk to the elders and the parents and the fathers as well as the mothers, they want their daughters to go to school. They want their siblings, their girls, their mothers to be treated well in a hospital. They want their women, their mothers, to give birth safely in a healthcare clinic. So they want food on the table for their families. So there's a lot of local agency that allows us to continue to do that work, because they convince the local authorities that they want their schools open, that they want their healthcare clinics there, that they want our women to work in the way that they did. So again, that local agency and resilience and ability to fight, to continue to fight for the country that they deserve, I think is always massively impressive and humbling, frankly, if you go there. So I think we should continue to, I mean, hope springs internal in this sector. If you're not a bit of an optimist, I don't think you last very long. And you have to remind yourself that progress in the end is never a linear thing. Yes, there is an arc, and it will bend. And sometimes it takes longer than you'd like. It certainly takes longer than we think is necessary. You know, we know what it takes to avoid food insecurity, famine, to treat children from childhood illnesses, to prevent newborns from dying. But we have to take heart in the fact that we did have that impact over the last 20 years, that we were able to do our work at scale and with quality and in a principled manner, with all of the sometimes the flaws that were there and the imperfections that we have in all of the countries where we work, including in this country. So I think you can never give up that hope. And I think if we allow the backslide to happen here and turn our backs on it and say, oh, let's just go work somewhere else where it is sort of slightly less hard, we're essentially saying it is okay if half of the population gets completely eradicated and avoided, and essentially, will be the majority of the victims of food insecurity, health issues in a country is essentially choosing that to happen. And I think that that is unconscionable.
What gives me hope is organizations such as Save the Children didn't leave. They are there on the ground working. What gives me hope is the youth, but also local agency in Afghanistan. When I was coming here on my way, I was talking to my father and I told him about this event. His response was, Afghanistan is the worst country for women. So my child, go ahead, amplify, empower Afghan women's voices and raise your voice as much as you can. You have the liberty. Afghans do want educated women. Afghans do want free women. And that's what gives me hope.
Thank you very much. Now we'll go to the audience. We'll take 2 questions at a time, and the mics will be passed around. I have one question here. Oh yeah, stand up and introduce yourself as well.
My name is Saik Shajan. I'm an Afghan. I'm a visiting scholar at Harvard Law School. So thank you so much for the excellent presentation. I have 2 questions for each panelist, if I'm allowed. So the very first question for you, Janti, I'm glad that you're happy that the number of internationals working at Save the Children is around 25% or so. 25 people. Okay, I take my question then. There is no question. Thank you so much. That's a very good number. Because one of the things that we had during the past 20 years, a lot of money was spent on high salaries. And on top of that, you have Azard pay, you have like security arrangement, all those kind of things. But that's wonderful. Thank you so much. To you, Ms. Naheed, thank you so much for your presentation. The question that I have, it follows up on Mr. Bigi's question about responsibility. I completely agree with you that warlords and everyone else, but at the end of the day, I think it's us that we failed. We, the Afghans, failed. And the reason that I'm saying that is that in 2014, September, when President Ghani took office, he inherited a relatively functioning Afghanistan. Afghanistan was in a better state, but by 2021, we saw that Afghanistan was falling. It was obvious. Sooner or later, it would have fallen. And one of the reasons was that the diplomacy of Afghanistan was failing. You would see around the region, Moscow, China, Turkey, Qatar, and others, they were hosting Taliban, and they were respecting them more than the government of Afghanistan. I would like to hear your opinion that where that was coming from, what happened. Was it because that President Ghani was so naive about things happening around him, and he was circled by a group of only 2 to 3 people, where they would just bring people who were naive about Afghanistan, who had no connection, no ties with Afghanistan. For example, don't want to name people, but the National Security Advisor had no diplomacy background. He was appointed as ambassador of Afghanistan to the United States, which ultimately kind of like really we saw how the relationship between the 2 countries went down. I'm trying to cut it short. Similarly, we had a medical doctor appointed as chief administrator of the president office, very much acting as prime minister of Afghanistan, no background in administration. We have examples at the Ministry of Defense. We have examples at the Ministry of Interior. Glad that we had women, but we had other qualified women to replace them. While those women that they were working, they had no experience working in the military sector. And do you see that that was part of the reason that why the government failed, why Ghani failed? And at the end, it's almost 600 nights that me and almost 40 million Afghans like me, they have sleepless nights. Thank you.
We'll get a second question as well at the back there.
Hi, I am Tasneem Gogowala. I would want to say a big fan of Yanti. I think that's why I'm here, along with some of our other friends from Boston supporters of Save the Children. I have a question first for Yanti. Is Save the Children has had a very long history in Afghanistan. You personally are very aware of the programs by visiting them multiple times. If you had to choose one success story, one human success story, because of an intervention done by Save the Children, what would it be and why did it have a profound impact on you and why? Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, we'll get questions like that. Very short questions, please, because I want to ask people. And next time we'll ask Mr. Sayek to be a panelist because they have a lot of insights. But yeah, yeah. Yeah, and the crux of your question is super important, and hopefully we can get an answer to that.
Um, no, I second Sahel John, right? Yes, I second what you said. Multiple parties involved, former warlords, corrupt officials, and young technocrats who were quite far from the context and ground realities of Afghanistan are equally responsible for the collapse of the country. It also, before the collapse, had actually added to the insecurity, to a weakened internal government, weakening centralized government. For instance, I was once as director for high government officials asset registration and verification. I don't know if we have time to share this story. Do we? Okay. I won't name anyone, but I went to an official who was a former warlord and also a governor of a major city. Our team and I went to his office, asked to register his form, asset registration. We ended up blindfolded, just driving around somewhere in the city. And then we ended up in the midst of nowhere in a desert with our phones and everything taken from us. So we were not hurt, but it was a message to the central government that don't you dare interfere in my role. And the central government couldn't really do anything.
That's the story. Thank you, Tasneem. Yeah, it's always good to ask. Actually, I tend to gloss over it. God, there's many. I would perhaps name two. I think our work training female teachers was actually one of the most important things we have done, and are trying to continue to do to this day, because I think that ultimately also speaks to the sustainability of the work on education, not just education done by Save the Children, but education writ large in the country. And you have to believe that at some point, girls will be allowed back to school. The other one was actually, it's also an education one. Accelerated learning is an intervention that Save the Children runs in a number of countries. Also infamously so in West Africa after the Ebola pandemic ravaged 3 countries there, and children were out of school for a long time. And you can see where this is going. Schools being closed for a long time. Sounds familiar, right? So a lot of children in Afghanistan were out of school because of conflict, even well before 2021. So we were running accelerated learning interventions to make sure that children could, if they had been out of school for months on end, could we help them catch up and get back to the levels where they would have been had they still have gone to school. So it's a specifically slightly technical intervention where you engage children, their parents, the teachers in the community to help them catch up, meet them where they are, so test them to see where they are, and then essentially personalize the intervention to make sure that they can catch up, and they test them after the intervention, and then when they're back at the right level, they can go back into school. So that's the intervention we also ran in Afghanistan many years before a pandemic closed all of our schools everywhere. And we've actually been using that experience now in many other countries where we see kids clearly haven't been massively impacted, because it wasn't just a relevant great story of impact in Afghanistan, it ultimately helped us do that work elsewhere.
Perfect, thank you. There's a question in the back there. Right.
Thank you so much for this panel. My question is a quick question about financial access for Janti. What sort of challenges is Save the Children facing since 2021, given the numerous sanctions and also the wariness of banks to process financial transfers into Afghanistan? And what sort of innovations might Save the Children be using, whether that's engagement with the Hawala system or other methods of financial transfer? Thank you.
And a question here.
Thank you. First of all, I would like to thank you from Kennedy School and from our panelists. My name is Sahar. I have worked for more 6 years with Ministry of Women Affairs and Ministry of Justice of Afghanistan for women rights and reforming the justice system of Afghanistan. Unfortunately, after the Taliban rule Afghanistan, so I lost my job, and currently I'm a scholar visitor at Harvard Law School. My question, and now I'm working on a research paper about the education rights of girls in Afghanistan after coming of the Taliban. My question is about the current situation of Afghanistan. We can see the Taliban, sometimes they arrest education rights activists, and at the same time they promise we will allow girls go to school. Today, I read another letter the Taliban they published about the opening of school after Ramadan. So how we can be optimistic about their speech? And some country they trying to recognize the Taliban. So what you think about this? Thank you.
Wants to take this?
The cash one first. The cash one is easier than the second one, I think. So yeah, sanctions absolutely impact our work. I would say though that I was actually delighted at the end of last year that the Security Council allowed humanitarian exemptions to, well, it's essentially saying humanitarians can continue to do the work even though if there are sanctions on particular regimes, not just for Afghanistan, but for everywhere. A long, hard-fought win that was going on for more than 10 years, right? So that's massively helpful. In the case of Afghanistan particularly, I would say US Treasury Department has been incredibly helpful and proactive in this space. General licenses were issued very early on. Comfort letters were given. It is very hard well, certainly it's impossible for humanitarians to influence risk appetite from commercial banks, right? And I would say there's very, very little appetite for commercial banks to do business in Afghanistan to date, even with general licenses in place and comfort letters and everything. So there's been an attempt. It's been super hard. There is not a functioning central bank currently in Afghanistan. So yes, we are using the Hawala system, which we do elsewhere with a lot of vetting and a lot of sort of risk mitigation around it. It's not ideal, but it does work. And then the UN, of course, also made sure that there was a cash line essentially into the country, which helped not only the Afghan economy, but also helped all of the humanitarian organizations being able to do their work.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Sahar John. About optimism and recognition, Taliban yesterday, they issued a new proclamation basically abandoning women from female UN employees. I hope it doesn't happen with other humanitarian organizations, but Afghan women are no longer allowed to go to even work with UN agencies. So what I'm optimist is Afghans themselves. I do see in one of his interviews, Abdul Qahar Balkhi once mentioned that Abdul Qahar Balkhi is the spokesperson for Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Once mentioned that Afghans, so banning girls from education and public sphere in general is Afghan culture. And I did an I conducted an informal research. I interviewed about 30 women from 8 different provinces of Afghanistan. Their wants and needs is really not that different from yours and ours. Women in even ruralist of the rural areas, Afghan women today do want to be educated. So that's what makes me hopeful an optimist for the future of Afghanistan and women specifically. Recognition is a leverage. The current regime does desperately want to be recognized, especially by the US. So do take advantage of my message to US policymakers, do take advantage of that leverage.
We have time for 2 more questions, one at the back and then one here. Oh.
Hi, my name is Farid. I'm also from Afghanistan and a Boston resident. My question is to Janti about humanitarian aid. I think, how do you reconcile the fact that over the past 20 years, Afghans became largely dependent on aid and the salaries were tied to aid now that there was a lot of aid flight? It's, with all due respect to the work that you're doing, I think it's incredibly important with the lives you're saving. My experience is, after contacting family members back in Afghanistan, a lot of them, I come from a village where people have farmed for all their lives. And then in the past 20 years, they all flooded to Kabul for NGO work, for work in the private sector. All of those dried up. And then all of them are now stuck in Kabul. They don't want to go back to the village where work is hard and there's abundant lands and nobody wants to farm them. And I think that this is a big problem for Afghanistan, is that they've all, the people have been used to relying on aid to go on with their lives. I think that now that you mentioned there's some stability, we need this entrepreneurial drive in the country that is lacking, partly because of the reliance on aid. So my question is there broad conversations among organizations that are working in Afghanistan, aid organizations, to address this so that you're not hopefully trying to do the same thing there forever?
Hi, my name is Zoya. I'm a student here. I have worked in Afghanistan before as well, in the same compound as Save the Children, Green Village. And my question is, you mentioned about there was a ban on women working in those principled humanitarian work that you said you stopped it, and then sort of negotiated with them province by province. I was wondering if I could hear a little more about that, because that kind of gives some hope that it is possible, and the blanket ban is not something that fully will stay forever. Thanks.
So on the broader point about sustainability, look, humanitarians are the first ones to say that they do not want to be the only show in town. And actually, we weren't before August of 2021. Yes, there was a reliance on aid, but there was also massive amounts of development funding going into the country, helping build infrastructure. To your point about Kabul being one of the, and it was true. I saw it. You could see it with your own eyes how that city essentially was growing. Both in height as well as in breadth. There was a real blossoming private sector with lots of female entrepreneurs, by the way. When I was there in January, it was interesting. A lot of the international community, of course, has not returned to Kabul, unfortunately. But the World Bank is there, UNDP is there, and they were certainly pushing for not having humanitarians be the sole interlocutor there for a regime that we may not agree with, that we may not want to recognize, but you have to find common ground on the things that you can agree. They can be smaller things, they can be things like counterterrorism, they can be things like economic development, but you have to find other ways, because if humanitarian aid is your only leverage, it becomes very quickly about, do this or we'll stop treating your children from malnutrition symptoms. And to put our staff on the front end of that decision making, I think is frankly really, really hard. And that's what we're doing today, right? So we are withholding treatment for kids dying if we cannot work with women, right? And we are, because we know why we do it, right? But there has to be a larger show in town. So we would always say that we'd never want to be the only game there. And that's why we would argue for more continued political engagement, right? It doesn't have to be one leverage point, but there must be a bit more creativity in thinking through what that then would look like without condoning policies that we don't agree with. But we have that all over the world, frankly.
Perfect. Thank you very much. We're at time now. I just want to, oh. Oh. Okay, they'll talk about it. Thank you so much for everybody who came here today. And I want to thank Fatima and the CID and the Kennedy School broadly for hosting this event. And I hope that this kind of gave us some food for thought and also like some hope for the future of the country and realizing the complexities and nuances of Afghanistan. Fatima wants to say something, and I hope I was a good moderator.
You're an excellent moderator, Mohammed. Well, I just want to say, I mean, you guys really touched on so many different issues of complexity, emotional, physical, financial, social, cultural. There's a lot to unpack here, and I know an hour doesn't do it justice. So this is just the tip of the iceberg for these types of conversations. I want to flag what's coming up next in our Spotlight series for those that are interested, and you can get all of this off of the CID homepage under our events on our Spotlight series. So next, a week from now on April 12th, we have a workshop that just got advertised. It will be led by Dr. Seema Samar, who's the former Minister of Women's Affairs in Afghanistan, and it'll look at threats to reproductive rights under the Taliban. Following that, we have on April 18th, we have a conversation on human rights in Afghanistan led by Ken Roth and Seema Samar. So please join us for that. And on April 21st, we have the former central bank governor of Afghanistan coming to speak here as well. We have other resources, materials. We're also looking for anyone who's interested in learning more or doing more with us on the Spotlight series. Come talk to me. We kicked it off, but it really takes all of you to continue it and to lean in. One of the things we've noticed is that there's a deafening silence on all things Afghanistan, certainly here in the United States, but in other countries as well. And so part of this is to really raise attention, awareness, and we want to keep the conversations going and put pressure on policymakers to care about the situation affecting 40 million today and for generations to come. So for those of you that are interested in engaging, please do reach out to any of us, and my doors are available as well. For the career chats, if you're interested, I just want to give you the room numbers. If you're interested in joining us, Janti will be in OFER 401. Did I get that right, Claire? Okay. In OFER 401, which is the Gender Equity Seminar Room, and we'll be doing a group career chat around careers at Save the Children. And Naheed will be in Rubenstein 434, the CID space down there. She's 20-minute slots, and if you're interested and didn't sign up but would be interested in talking to Naheed, please, oh, right here. Look at that, technology. Just put in the QR code and you can see which slots are available to sign up there as well. So thank you guys and gals very, very much.